My father raised his glass at the head of the table, and I already knew before he opened his mouth that whatever came next was going to sting. 60 people were watching him. 60 people in our living room with their champagne flutes and their holiday dresses and their polite, expectant smiles. The Christmas tree in the corner was strung with white lights my mother had spent 3 days arranging. The dining table had been extended with 2 extra leaves, draped in cream linen, set with the china she kept locked in a cabinet the rest of the year. My father loved an audience. He had always loved an audience. "To my daughter Vanessa," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "who made partner at 31. Who proved that this family raises winners." Everyone applauded. My sister stood next to Tyler and smiled the way she always smiled, measured, graceful, the smile of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years. Tyler put his arm around her waist. My father looked at him with the approval he reserved for people who had earned it. Then my father's eyes moved across the table. "They found me," he smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't reach anything. "And Claire," he said, tilting his glass slightly in my direction, "who teaches 2nd grade. We are very proud of her enthusiasm." A few people laughed. Not cruelly, they probably didn't even realize. But my father's pause before enthusiasm had been perfectly placed, and the people who knew him understood exactly what he meant. I kept my hands flat on my thighs under the table. I did not look away from him. I had learned a long time ago that looking away was worse. Then my father looked at Marcus, sitting beside me in the blazer I had asked him to wear, and his smile changed into something that wasn't a smile at all. "And this," my father said, "must be the furniture man." Marcus set his fork down quietly. Across the table, Tyler's father, a man named Gerald, who I had met exactly once before tonight, looked up from his plate. He had been eating, half listening, the way older men do at parties when the conversation doesn't concern them. But something shifted in his face. He looked at Marcus once, looked away, then looked back again. "Wait," Gerald said. He set his own fork down. His wife turned to look at him. "Marcus, what's your last name?" Marcus said it. The color left Gerald's face. The room went very quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when something has happened that no one yet understands. I need to go back, because none of what happened that night makes sense without understanding how I got there, sitting at my parents' Christmas table, in a dress I had ironed twice, waiting for my father to decide whether I was worth acknowledging. I was 28 years old. I taught 2nd grade at an elementary school, 20 minutes from the apartment I rented alone. And I loved it, the way you love things that wear you out completely with your whole body, with the specific exhaustion of something that matters. I had been teaching for 4 years. I was not going to become a lawyer. I was not going to become a doctor, or a developer, or a partner at anything. My father had known this since I was 22, and had chosen education over pre-law. And in the 6 years since, he had not once asked me a single question about my classroom, my students, or my work. My mother was more subtle. She asked questions, but they were the kind that contained their conclusions already. "Are you still teaching?" As though she expected the answer to have changed. "And you enjoy it?" The way you ask someone if they enjoy their commute, an acknowledgement of necessity, not interest. My sister Vanessa was not unkind. I want to be clear about that. She had never mocked me, never joined in when my father made his particular jokes about tenure and summers off. But she had grown up in the same house I had, under the same set of values, and she had met them perfectly. She was a corporate attorney. She drove a car my father had bought her when she passed the bar. She was engaged to Tyler, whose family owned 3 commercial properties in the city, and whose last name carried its own kind of weight. My sister had done everything right. I did not blame her for that. But I understood that my father's love had a currency, and she had accumulated far more of it than I had. I met Marcus in October, 14 months before that Christmas dinner. I was at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, moving between stalls with a canvas bag and no real plan, and I stopped in front of a table because the wooden cutting board sitting on it was the most beautiful object I had ever seen in a context where I was also buying kale. It was made from 3 different woods, something pale, something dark, something with a reddish grain I couldn't name, and they had been fitted together so precisely that the seams looked intentional, like lines in a drawing. "You're staring at it like you're trying to figure something out," someone said. I looked up. The man behind the table was watching me with amusement that was not unkind. How do the colors stay separate? I asked. Why don't they bleed together? They're different species, he said. Maple, walnut, and cherry. They don't bleed because they were never trying to become each other. I bought the cutting board. I also stood there for 25 minutes talking to him about wood grain and color and the specific satisfaction of making something with your hands that would outlast the conversation you were having about it. His name was Marcus. He was 30 years old. He had calluses on his palms that he didn't seem self-conscious about, and he talked about his work the way I talked about my students, like it was the thing he had organized the rest of his life around. I gave him my number before I left. He texted me that afternoon. On our third date, I asked him directly what he did. I had gathered that he worked with wood, that he ran some kind of small operation, that he had a shop somewhere outside the city. He described it modestly. Custom furniture, mostly residential clients, some small commercial work. He said he had a few people who worked with him. He said business was okay. I did not ask follow-up questions because I was not the kind of person who needed a man's career to be impressive in order to find him interesting. Marcus was interesting for entirely other reasons. He was quiet in a way that was full rather than empty. He read more than anyone I'd ever dated. He called his mother every Sunday. When I told him about a student who had been struggling, a boy named Eli who couldn't read at level and whose home situation was complicated, Marcus listened for 40 minutes and asked the right questions. I fell in love with him in December of the first year, 3 months in, when he showed up at my door on a Tuesday night with soup because I had mentioned in a text that I wasn't feeling well. Not with flowers. With soup he had made himself, in a container he had clearly washed first, with a second container of something he called, just in case, crackers. I did not tell my parents about him for 5 months. I knew how it would go. My father would ask what Marcus did, and I would say he was a woodworker, and something in my father's face would close the way it always closed when a piece of information failed to meet his requirements. I had seen that face my entire life. I had been on the receiving end of it since I was a sophomore in college, explaining that I wanted to teach children, not argue contracts. When I finally told my mother about Marcus in March, she was pleasant. She said that sounded lovely. She asked if he had a degree. I said yes. She asked from where. I told her. She said, "Oh," in the tone that means the answer was acceptable but not impressive, and then she moved on. My father met Marcus for the first time at a Sunday dinner in August. He shook Marcus's hand and asked him his last name, and then asked what he did. Marcus said he ran a woodworking studio. My father asked if that was a business or a hobby. Marcus said it was a business. My father nodded in the way that means understood and filed under irrelevant, and turned to my sister to ask about her caseload. At dinner, my father told a long story about a real estate deal he was closing, and then asked Tyler about a client of his firm's that my father knew. The conversation moved around Marcus like water around a stone, not hostile, exactly, but effortlessly exclusive. My mother asked Marcus once if he ever did kitchen renovations. He said that wasn't really his area. She nodded and offered him more bread. On the drive home, Marcus was quiet. "I'm sorry," I said. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "I know. I'm sorry anyway." He reached over and put his hand on mine, and we drove the rest of the way without talking, and that was somehow more comforting than anything he could have said. The Christmas dinner was my mother's idea. She hosted it every year, her way of consolidating all the socializing she was expected to do into one event she could control. 60 guests. Family, her book club, colleagues of my father's, neighbors, the parents of Vanessa's fiancé. It was the kind of party where everyone was performing slightly, including the hosts, and the point was not warmth but the appearance of warmth, which in my family had always been considered close enough. I asked Marcus not to come. I want to be honest about that. I asked him in November, 2 weeks after my mother called to say she expected both of us there. I sat on my couch with my phone and typed out a message explaining that the dinner was going to be complicated, that my father would be his usual self, that I didn't want to put Marcus through another evening of being looked past. I told him he could say he had other plans. I told him I would understand. He read the message and called me instead of texting back. "Do you want me there?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said. I just don't want it to be unpleasant for you. Claire, he said. I've been to your parents' house. I know what your father thinks of me. I'm not going to stop coming to things because he's decided I'm not worth his attention. A pause. Unless you don't want me there. That's a different conversation. I want you there, I said. Then I'll be there. He showed up on Christmas Eve, in a blazer over a dark green sweater, with a bottle of wine he had clearly researched, and a small wooden ornament. He had made a simple star, sanded, smooth, with a hook at the top that he handed to my mother when she opened the door. My mother looked at it briefly, and set it on the entryway table, and thanked him, and took his coat. The evening moved the way those evenings move. Drinks in the living room. My father holding court with Tyler's father, Gerald, and two other men I recognized as business associates. My sister, circulating, doing the thing she was good at, making everyone feel briefly like the most interesting person in the room. My mother refreshing platters and accepting compliments on the house. I stayed close to Marcus. I watched my father notice that I was staying close to Marcus and make no effort to come speak to us. Gerald found us, actually. I was surprised by it. He came over during the cocktail hour with his wife and introduced himself properly, shaking Marcus's hand and making real eye contact, and I remember thinking he seemed like someone who had retained his manners despite having enough money to abandon them. What do you do? Gerald asked Marcus. I run a woodworking studio, Marcus said. Custom furniture, mostly. Residential? Mostly. Some commercial. We did a full office build-out last year. That was new for us. Gerald tilted his head slightly. Where's your studio based? Marcus told him. Gerald looked at him the way you look at someone when a piece of information is knocking on a door inside your head but hasn't opened it yet. Then my father appeared at Gerald's shoulder and asked about someone's property listing, and the conversation dissolved, and we went in to dinner. My father gave his toast. He said what he said about Vanessa. He said what he said about me. He looked at Marcus and called him the furniture man, and I pressed my hands flat against my thighs and held my father's gaze and did not flinch. Then Gerald looked up. Then Gerald said Marcus's last name back to him like a question. The room was quiet in the way I described that specific silence that precedes understanding. Gerald stood up from his chair. He was not a dramatic man. I had gathered that in the hour I'd spent near him. He stood up the way you stand up when something requires it, not for effect. You're Marcus, who runs the studio on Callaway Road, Gerald said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Marcus said. The Hargrove building, Gerald said. Downtown. 32nd floor. The entire executive suite. My father turned his head slowly toward Gerald. That's ours, Marcus said. His voice was even, calm. The voice of someone who had not been performing a version of himself all evening. We finished that installation in September. The conference table, the partner desks, the built-in shelving along the north wall. My board, Gerald said, has had 4 meetings in that room since September. Every single time, before the meeting starts, someone asks about the table. He shook his head slowly. I have been trying to remember the name. I had the invoice, and then we switched billing systems and I lost it. He turned to look at my father. My father's expression had done something I had never seen it do before. It had gone very still, the way a surface goes still when something has moved through it and the movement hasn't caught up with the face yet. Richard, Gerald said. This young man's studio built the centerpiece of my entire executive floor. I have sent 3 clients up to that room specifically to sit at that table. He looked back at Marcus. I've been trying to reach your studio for 2 weeks about a second project. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and set a card on the table. The website is on there, he said. Or you can email directly. Gerald picked it up. My father looked at the card. He looked at Marcus. He looked at me. I looked back at my father, and I did not say anything at all, because there was nothing I needed to say. The rest of the evening moved strangely. The toast had dissolved into whatever comes after a toast when the room needs to recalibrate, and people began eating, and the conversations reformed in new shapes. Gerald spent 40 minutes talking to Marcus at the end of the table. I sat beside Marcus and listened, and said very little. My mother came over once and asked if Marcus needed anything, and her voice had a different quality to it than it had when she'd taken his coat. My sister found me in the kitchen later, while I was helping clear the appetizer plates. She stood in the doorway with her wine. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't. Dad's going to process this badly before he processes it well. I know that too, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The ornament Marcus made, she said. I put it on the tree. Mom left it on the entryway table, and I moved it. I looked at her. She was looking at her wine. Thank you, I said. She nodded and went back to the party. On the drive home, Marcus was quiet for a long time, which was normal for him. I was quiet too. The city moved past the windows in its Christmas light way, blurred and bright. You knew who Gerald was, I said eventually. When he asked you about the studio. I recognized his name, Marcus said. We did do the Hargrove building. It's the biggest commercial project we've taken on. He glanced at me. I wasn't performing modesty when I described the studio to your dad. We're a small operation, 8 people, including me. We do good work and we're growing. But I'm not secretly running some empire. Gerald is one of my father's most important business relationships, I said. I gathered that. What are you thinking? He was quiet for another block. I'm thinking about Eli, he said. I turned to look at him. Eli was my student, the one who had been struggling, the one Marcus had listened to me talk about for 40 minutes on a Tuesday night. What about Eli? You told me in November that he read his first full page out loud in class. Without stopping. That you had to go into the hallway after because you didn't want to cry in front of the kids. He kept his eyes on the road. I thought about that for 3 days. What it means to be the person who was in that room for that. What it means that you've dedicated your life to being in that room. He shook his head slightly. Your father called you enthusiastic like it was a consolation prize. I just keep thinking about Eli reading that page. I didn't say anything for a moment. The lights went by. I love you, I said. I know, he said. I love you too. That's why I put on a blazer and went to the dinner. My father called me on December 27th. I had been expecting either the call or the silence, and I had decided I was equally prepared for both. He called at 10 in the morning, which told me he had thought about it for 2 days before deciding to act. Gerald Hargrove, my father said, without a greeting, called me yesterday to say he's commissioning Marcus for the renovation of his lake house. I heard, I said, which was true. Marcus had told me the night before. You should have told me what he did, my father said. I sat with this for a moment. Outside my window, the street was quiet and gray. I told you what he did, I said. I told you he ran a woodworking studio. You asked if it was a business or a hobby, and then you moved on. A silence. The way you introduced him at dinner, I said, in front of 60 people. You called him the furniture man. Another silence. I have spent 6 years watching you look at my job the same way, I said. My voice was steady. I had not planned this speech. It was coming from somewhere that had been collecting material for a long time. You have never asked me the name of a single student I've taught. You have never asked what I love about the work. When Vanessa passed the bar, you flew to the city to take her to dinner. When I got my teaching certificate, you sent a card. I paused. The card said, "Best of luck with the new adventure." My father was very quiet. I'm not asking you to think teaching is as prestigious as law, I said. I'm asking you to consider that your daughter has spent 4 years learning the names of every child who has passed through her classroom and caring about what happens to them. And that the man you called the furniture man built something so beautiful that a roomful of executives stops every meeting to talk about it. I stopped. I'm asking you to consider that prestige and worth are not the same thing. The silence on the line was long enough that I thought he might have hung up. Your mother and I, he said finally, would like to have you and Marcus for dinner. When the holidays are over. It was not an apology. It was not, exactly, an acknowledgement. But from my father, it was a beginning. And I had learned to recognize the difference between a door being slammed and a door being held at the frame. And this was the second one. I'll ask Marcus, I said. And Dad, if you have him over for dinner, you ask him about his work. You ask him real questions. And you ask me real questions too. A pause. All right, he said. I hung up and sat for a while in my quiet apartment. In February, Marcus was commissioned for a third project through Gerald's referral. In March, a design magazine reached out to feature the studio in a piece about American craft furniture. Marcus called me when he got the email, and his voice had the particular texture of someone trying to be calm about something that was the opposite of calm. I was in my classroom when he called. I was between reading groups, sitting on the low bookshelf I sat on when I read aloud to the kids, and I pressed the phone to my ear and smiled until my face did something embarrassing. "This is real, right?" he said. "This is actually happening." "It's real," I said. He exhaled. "I have to call my mom." "Call your mom," I said. "I'll call you tonight." I taught the afternoon the way I always taught the afternoon, fully, without the part of my brain that lives outside that classroom being able to enter it. This is one of the things I have come to understand about my work. It demands all of you. You cannot be half present in front of a 7-year-old who is learning to trust that the words on a page are something they can decode. They will know. They can always tell. At 3:15, after the last student had been picked up and the cubbies were emptied and the chairs were on the desks, I sat at my own desk and looked at the room. The drawings on the bulletin board. The reading corner with its beanbag chairs that had been restuffed twice. The word wall that covered the entire back panel, which the kids added to themselves with index cards, words they found interesting, words they had discovered that week, words they wanted to own: magnificent, peculiar, unbreakable. Eli had put up unbreakable in January. He had asked me how to spell it first, carefully, and then written it himself in his irregular second-grade handwriting, and found a spot near the top where there was room. My father had never asked me about any of this. But I thought, sitting there in my classroom in the last of the February light, that there was still time, that people could learn to ask better questions, that the distance between where my father was and where I needed him to be was real but not necessarily permanent. I did not know if we would close it. I knew that I was willing to sit at the table and try, which was the same willingness I had asked of him. This is the thing I had learned from teaching children, which my father would perhaps one day understand if he ever asked. Most things that are worth anything require you to show up before you are certain it will work. Eli did not know he could read that page before he read it. He knew only that the person across from him believed he could, and that was enough to begin. I turned off the classroom lights and gathered my bag. Marcus picked me up from school that afternoon. He was parked at the curb in his truck, and when I came through the front doors, he was leaning against the driver's side in the late winter cold, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked like a person who was exactly where he was supposed to be. "How was your day?" he asked. "Good," I said. Eli read the whole chapter, on his own. Marcus's face did the thing it did when something mattered to him. The whole chapter, without stopping. He shook his head, smiling in the way he rarely smiled without any control over it. He opened the truck door for me, and I got in, and he walked around to his side, and we drove through the city in the particular quiet that is not absence but fullness, the kind you build over 14 months with someone who has shown up every time it was asked of him. My father was not yet the father I needed him to be. Marcus's studio was not yet the studio it was going to become. We were not yet at the end of any story. But I had stopped waiting for the end of the story before I agreed to live it. That had always been the mistake. I had spent years in my parents' house believing that my value would eventually be legible to them, that one day the right credential or the right moment would translate me into a language my father could read. I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for someone like Gerald to stand up from a table and say the words that would make my father look at me differently. And Gerald had stood up, and my father had looked. But I understood now, driving home through the city with Marcus, that this was not what had changed anything. What had changed was that I had stopped needing it to. Somewhere in the 14 months between the farmer's market and the Christmas table, I had quietly stopped organizing my life around my father's ability to see it clearly. I had stopped having myself to fit through a door he had decided was the only way in. I still loved my father. I still wanted him at the table. I had told him so on the phone, with my voice steady and my hands calm, because some part of me had learned from teaching children that love and accountability are not opposites, that you can hold someone to a higher standard precisely because you believe they are capable of meeting it. My father had said all right. That would have to be enough for today. Tomorrow was a longer project. I looked out the truck window at the city going by, at the lit windows and the bare trees and the ordinary Thursday evening life of people who were also, somewhere, working on their longer projects. I thought about my classroom. I thought about the word wall. I thought about Unbreakable and Eli's handwriting near the top, in the spot where there was room. Marcus reached over and put his hand on mine, and I turned my palm up to hold it, and we drove the rest of the way home without needing to say anything at all. Because some things you build slowly enough that by the time you have them, you no longer need to name them. You just keep them.